Snow drifted across the valley like slow-moving breath, as if the world itself exhaled a tired sigh against the weight of winter. Jane Mayfield stood in her doorway, wrapped in a woolen shawl the color of old rose petals, the fabric trembling each time the wind curled around her slender frame. She had grown used to winter's touch, used to the way it pressed its cold palm against her cheek, as though reminding her that even the land could be lonely. The cabin behind her smelled faintly of cedar smoke and dried sage, the last comforts of a life lived quietly on the edge of a world that never truly welcomed her. She watched the far line of the horizon with a stillness that belonged to someone who had learned to carry her burdens without letting them bend her spine. Her heart beat softly, like a small creature afraid to disturb the silence. She sensed them before she saw them. A ripple moved across the snow, like the land itself was bracing for something heavy. Two figures emerged from the white veil, towering shapes carved in stone and shadow. Their breath rose in warm clouds that vanished almost instantly into the icy air. Talon Greyhawk walked in front, his dark hair tied loosely behind him, his chest bare despite the bitter cold. Muscles rippled across him like sculpted river rock, each movement deliberate, each step asserting quiet authority. Behind him came his older brother Cale, broader and colder, his gaze sharp as a winter blade. Their presence filled the valley with a pressure that pushed at Jane's lungs. She did not step back. She only tightened her shawl and willed her voice to remain as steady as the ground beneath her. She had known the Greyhawk brothers all her life, though they belonged to a world that seldom touched hers. They were the guardians of the Apache lands that brushed against her father's property lines, the same lands contested by treaties that changed with the wind. She felt Talon's eyes find her through the swirling snow, lingering in a way that made her heart shift, though she could not explain why. Cale's gaze swept past her with the indifference of a man accustomed to commanding obedience. When they reached her doorway, Cale spoke first. His voice held no warmth, carrying the clipped authority of a man who believed every word he uttered was law. He told her to pack her things, that she had until morning to leave this land. His tone was not cruel, merely final, like a verdict delivered by nature itself. The words fell between them like heavy snow, muffling everything except the dull thud of her heartbeat. Jane felt the weight of her father's memory press against her chest. This cabin, this patch of frozen earth, was all she had left of the life that once shielded her from the world's harsh edges. Talon said nothing. He stood a step behind Cale, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity she could not decipher. There was something in his eyes, a question, a hesitation, perhaps even an apology wrapped in silence. The wind pulled at his long hair, carrying a strand across his cheek like a soft plea. Jane wondered if he wanted to speak and simply could not, bound by blood or duty, or the unspoken rules that govern men forged in hardship. She asked the only question that mattered. Why? The word escaped her lips like a fragile breath in the cold. Cale answered with the same unyielding tone. The tribe had decided the land must be reclaimed. Winter had tightened its grip, and they needed every stretch of territory to prepare for uncertain months ahead. The explanation was practical, stripped of sentiment, leaving her no room to argue. She felt the ground beneath her shift, as though the roots of her life had been pulled loose. Talon's eyes flickered toward his brother, then back to her. For a moment, the silence grew softer, like he was offering her a gentler truth he could not put into words. Jane sensed it. An unspoken understanding, something shaped by the quiet parts of their shared history. She remembered him as a boy watching her from across the creek, neither of them brave enough to close the distance. She remembered him as a young man standing tall beside Cale during disputes, his silence always speaking more than the harsh words others threw. Something about him had always lived in restraint, as though he feared what his heart might do if unleashed. The snow deepened around their feet, collecting on Cale's shoulders as if the sky itself agreed with his decision. Talon shifted slightly, the smallest break in his posture, and Jane felt the movement like a tremor beneath her ribs. She tried to respond, but her voice dissolved into the cold. There was nothing she could say that would change what had already been decided. She stood with her chin lifted, refusing to let either man see the fear twisting quietly inside her. Cale turned first, his decision executed without the need for further words. Talon hesitated. His gaze swept across her face with something dangerously close to regret. The wind howled softly between them, carrying a whisper of warmth from his breath to her skin. When he finally followed his brother, Jane felt the world narrow into the space they left behind. Their footprints trailed away like dark scars across the untouched snow. She remained in the doorway long after they disappeared, her breath forming small, trembling clouds that vanished as quickly as her hope. The valley was silent again, but it was a different silence, one thick with the echo of a choice she had no power to undo. Her heart pressed against her ribs, aching with the understanding that she had been given an impossible ultimatum. The cabin behind her seemed smaller, more fragile, like a memory fading even as she clung to it. When the last trace of their presence vanished into the white distance, she whispered into the frozen air, not knowing whether she spoke to herself or to the shadows of the departing brothers. But the wind carried her words softly across the barren land, as if delivering them to someone who might yet be listening. She stepped back into the cabin, closing the door slowly, listening to the wood groan as though sharing her sorrow. She moved around the room, touching objects not out of need but out of longing. Tracing her fingers along memories she was not ready to surrender. Each worn surface carried her father's quiet presence, sharpening the ache of impending loss. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of hooves fading into the distance. She stood still, letting the silence settle over her like a second skin. Somewhere in her chest, something fragile cracked open, releasing a thread of resolve she could barely name. And though she tried to steady her breath, she could not shake the certainty that Talon's eyes had held more than duty. That beneath all that winter steel, something in him had quietly broken too. The truth of it trembled through her like distant, uncertain thunder. Jane rose before the sun, though the sky outside remained an unbroken field of dim silver. Sleep had skirted her like a wary animal through the night, circling but never settling. Her thoughts moved in quiet, painful loops, returning again and again to the moment Cale delivered the order that threatened to scatter her roots across the wind. Yet when she stepped into the pale morning light, there was no trembling in her limbs, no sign that the earth beneath her had shifted so violently. She had learned long ago that some storms demanded stillness rather than struggle. She let the cold bite at her skin, welcomed the sting, and breathed until her heartbeat steadied. The valley lay silent, blanketed in snow that shimmered faintly beneath the dawn, as though the land itself waited to see whether she would bend or stand. She touched the cabin doorframe with soft fingers, honoring the years woven into its grain, then turned toward the small storage shed to begin sorting what must be packed. Inside the shed, dust-laced light filtered through cracks in the wood, catching the floating frost like drifting embers. Jane sifted through old tools, bundles of herbs, and pieces of her past she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Each item carried a memory, and each memory carried the weight of the father who had raised her with gentle steadiness. He had taught her that resilience was not hardness but quiet endurance. He had believed kindness was strength, even when the world punished it. She felt him now in the echo of the cold, guiding her hands as she chose what mattered most. A wool blanket her mother once patched. A small carved horse her father made when she was 10. A worn journal with pages only half filled. She paused over each, letting the stillness around her deepen into something like resolve. Though her heart ached, she would not shatter. She would not give Cale the satisfaction of seeing her crumble beneath a command. The town came into view when she ventured toward the well for water, its buildings softened beneath the thick snow. People moved with slow purpose, their boots crunching lightly, their breath rising in white threads that vanished before reaching the rooftops. Sheriff Amos stood beside the well, rubbing warmth into his gloved hands. His face, etched by years of winter and worry, brightened slightly when he saw her. He asked after her with a tenderness he rarely showed, but she brushed his concern aside with a soft smile. His shoulders sagged in quiet frustration, for he knew she carried too much alone. Nora Calder soon joined them, shawl wrapped tightly, cheeks flushed from the cold. She fussed the way only Nora could, urging Jane to stay with them until matters settled. But Jane gently refused. She could not sleep beneath another's roof, while the cabin still stood waiting for her decision. Whispers followed her as she walked through the marketplace. She felt them brushing her shoulders like drifting feathers. Some believed the Apache brothers had gone too far, while others murmured that Jane was too fragile to survive such conflict. Their words scraped lightly, But she held her chin high. She had weathered loneliness sharper than any thrown opinion. She understood that people saw softness in her, and mistook it for weakness. They did not see the layers beneath, the quiet steel shaped by loss and carved by the necessity of living alone since childhood. Each step she took toward home felt like an affirmation, as though the land recognized her resilience and steadied her feet. By midday, she returned to the cabin with water sloshing gently in her pail. The air felt different, charged as though holding its breath. She sensed someone before she saw him. Talon Greyhawk stood beside her porch, cloak draped over one shoulder this time, though his chest remained bare to the winter wind. Snowflakes rested on his hair like tiny pale beads. His presence shifted the world around him, sharpening its edges while softening the space between them. He watched her with an unreadable expression, hands loose at his sides, body poised in a stillness that hinted at conflict beneath the surface. He spoke her name softly, not as a command but as a quiet offering. She set the pail down and met his gaze with steady eyes. He told her he had come to see whether she understood the order, but she sensed truth hidden behind the formal words. Something hollowed the center of his voice, something almost ashamed. She asked if he agreed with Kale's decision. His breath caught imperceptibly before he answered that duty did not always move with the heart. A shadow crossed his expression, the kind born from years spent choosing obedience over desire. The wind tugged at his hair, pulling strands across his cheek like the brush of something tender he had long denied himself. Jane felt her pulse flutter, not from fear but from the strange warmth that spread in the space between them. She asked why he had come alone, and the question seemed to cut through him. He shifted his gaze, as though trying to hide the truth from himself. He said he wished only to be certain she would not resist. But the words lacked conviction. She saw through them as though they were made of thin, cracking ice. Talon was not a man accustomed to questioning orders, yet here he stood, braving the cold not for duty, but something deeper he could not name. She lifted the pail again, carried it inside, and left the door open, silently inviting him to step out of the storm if he wished. He hesitated, the conflict in him tightening his shoulders, then crossed the threshold with the careful grace of a man testing unfamiliar ground. His presence filled the small cabin with a heat sharper than the fire. He glanced at the half-packed belongings scattered across the floor, and something in his face tightened, as though seeing her life dismantled piece by fragile piece unsettled him more than he expected. They spoke little, but silence can reveal more than words. Talon's gaze moved over her hands as she folded a blanket, over the small carved horse she placed gently on the table, over the shawl she draped across a chair as though preparing to leave the ghost of her life behind. A softness crept into his eyes, hesitant and uncertain. She felt it like a trembling warmth brushing her skin. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again, burdened by the struggle between heart and obligation. When he finally stepped back outside, the sky had deepened into muted gray. He paused at the bottom of the steps, snow whispering around his boots, and looked at her once more. The moment stretched between them like a thin strand of silver, fragile yet unbroken. His voice, when it came, was low and strained. He told her the tribe expected her departure by sunrise. Then, after a heartbeat heavy with unspoken weight, he added that he would return to see her off. Not to enforce the command, he implied, but to witness what it cost her. As he turned away, she felt the truth settle in her chest like a slow-burning ember. Talon had not come to ensure her obedience. He had come because something in him feared losing her more than he dared admit. The wind swallowed his figure as he walked back into the winter, but his presence lingered in the doorway like a promise she did not yet understand. The creek ran thin beneath the winter's grip, its surface trembling with a fragile shimmer, as if the water fought quietly against turning to ice. Jane followed its winding path with a basket of herbs tucked under her arm, her boots sinking softly into the quilt of snow that blanketed the valley. She walked slowly, letting the cold sharpen her senses, letting the rhythm of each breath calm the knot forming in her chest. Soon she would be forced to leave this land, and every familiar sound felt like a farewell she had not agreed to. She knelt beside the creek and dipped her hands into the slow-moving water, hoping the chill might numb the ache beneath her ribs. A distant rustle startled the quiet. When she looked up, she saw a small figure stumbling through the brush on the opposite bank. Little Crow, the 12-year-old boy she had seen a handful of times near the trading post, pressed one hand to his arm, his face drained of color. Snow clung to his leggings and tangled in his long braids, making him look smaller than he already was. His steps faltered and his knees buckled. Without thinking, Jane crossed the shallow creek, icy water soaking her boots and biting into her skin. She reached him just as he fell forward into her arms, his breath sharp and ragged. Blood seeped through the torn hide on his arm, staining her sleeve with worry. She gathered him gently and whispered soothing words, though she wasn't sure he could hear her through the fog of pain. She guided him back to her cabin as carefully, as if carrying a fragile flame through harsh wind. The cold air stung both their faces, but Little Crow leaned into her, trusting her completely. When they reached the porch, she pushed the door open with her shoulder and carried him inside. Warmth spilled onto them from the hearth, where the morning fire still crackled low. She laid him on her bed and hurried to fetch bandages, boiling water, and a jar of crushed yarrow. His eyes fluttered open as she cleaned the wound, and he watched her with the weary curiosity of someone who knew kindness only in short, precious glimpses. She worked in silence, letting the small room fill with the muted hum of breath and fire. The door swung open without warning. Talon stepped inside, breath sharp, cloak dusted with snow. His eyes widened as they fell upon the boy lying in her bed, then traced the blood on her sleeves and the tenderness in her hands. His voice broke the silence like a warm gust against the cold. He asked what had happened, though the answer shone clearly before him. Jane told him she found the boy injured near the creek, and brought him here, because the cold would have worsened the wound. She expected anger, suspicion, or perhaps the same calculating distance he had shown before. Instead, his features softened, his jaw unclenching in a way she had never seen. He approached Little Crow with a gentleness that caught her breath, kneeling to examine the bandage she secured. The boy whispered something in Apache, and Talon placed a steady hand on his shoulder, offering silent reassurance. Jane watched Talon's posture shift, the tension easing from his shoulders, his voice lowering as he murmured to the boy. Something warm filled her chest, something both unfamiliar and tender, like sunlight slipping through a cracked shutter. Talon rose slowly, meeting her gaze with a depth she had not expected. Gratitude flickered there, quiet, earnest, and entirely unhidden. But the moment fractured with the sudden thud of heavy boots outside. The cabin door flew open again, and Cale entered with the force of a storm. His eyes swept across the room, landing on the sight of Little Crow resting in Jane's bed, and something cold and sharp formed behind his expression. He demanded to know why the boy had been brought here, his tone bruised with accusation. His words struck the air between them like stones thrown at fragile glass. Jane stepped instinctively in front of the bed. Her voice was steady as she explained what happened, but Cale's face remained carved from ice, unmoved by reason or compassion. He claimed she had no right to interfere, no right to touch Apache land or Apache lives, as though kindness were an offense punishable by exile. Talon moved before Jane could speak again, positioning himself between her and his brother with a quiet but unmistakable defiance. His eyes met Cale's with the weight of years long buried, resentments, doubts, and the unspoken grievances of two men shaped by different interpretations of strength. A tension simmered in the air, stretching thin as a drawn bowstring. Cale warned Talon not to forget his place, but Talon's voice, low and firm, answered that he had not forgotten anything, especially not what honor truly meant. The brothers stood locked in a silent battle, not of fists or blades, but of hearts and convictions. Jane felt the shift like a tremor beneath the wooden floor. Talon's stance was steady, but a tempest churned behind his eyes, a struggle between duty and conscience. Little Crow stirred behind her, whispering a weak plea for Cale to stop. Cale's expression cracked for the briefest moment, his gaze flickering to the boy. Something softened, and then hardened again, as though he refused the weakness of mercy. He muttered a command for Talon to leave with him, but Talon did not move. The silence stretched, taut and motionless, until Cale finally backed away, stepping outside with the heavy finality of a door slamming shut. His departure left the air weighted with unspoken fallout. Talon exhaled slowly, as though shedding a burden he had carried for far too long. He turned to Jane with gratitude unmasked, a warmth in his eyes that thawed something in both of them. He thanked her not with words alone, but with the quiet reverence of a man seeing a truth he had long overlooked. She felt her throat tighten at the gentleness in his voice, the recognition that her kindness had reached a part of him he had kept hidden from the world. He sat by the boy for a while, speaking softly, his large hands gentle as they brushed stray hair from Little Crow's brow. Jane watched him, struck by how effortlessly he balanced strength with tenderness, how natural compassion seemed in him when he allowed it space to breathe. When Little Crow finally drifted into restful sleep, Talon rose, his expression thoughtful and heavy. He approached Jane with a quiet hesitance, as if still learning how to stand within moments shaped by emotion rather than orders. He told her that Kale's anger came not from hatred of her but from fear. Fear of losing control, fear of change, fear of the fragile threads that bound their people to this land. He said it softly, yet the truth ran deep. Jane met his gaze, recognizing that the man before her was no longer the silent warrior who had delivered her eviction. Something in him had shifted, pulled gently but irrevocably by the sight of her compassion. He brushed a hand against the doorframe as if grounding himself before he spoke again. He admitted he had been fighting something unnamed since the moment he stepped into her cabin the day before. She felt the meaning hover in the air, too delicate to grasp, yet powerful enough to stir her breath. He stepped outside, letting the cold roll around him, but paused before descending the steps. His voice, when it came, was rough with conflict. He warned her that Kale would return soon, angrier than before, and that the next decisions would demand courage from them both. Then he vanished into the winter haze, leaving her standing in the doorway with her heart drumming against her ribs, knowing the storm ahead had changed shape, and that Talon for the first time might stand on her side. Jane awoke to a sky the color of pewter, the kind of muted winter light that made the world feel suspended between breath and silence. The cabin was still, holding the faint warmth of last night's fire, yet she felt a chill within her that no flame could soften. Little Crow slept peacefully near the hearth, his wound bound with new cloth Talon had brought before dawn. She watched the boy's steady breathing for a long moment, letting the quiet remind her why she had chosen compassion even when it placed her in danger. When she finally stepped outside, the valley greeted her with a wind that whispered of approaching storms. Snow swirled low across the ground, brushing against her boots as though urging her to move quickly. But she stood firm, hands wrapped around the edges of her shawl, refusing to let fear dictate her next steps. She sensed movement before she heard it, the weight of several horses pressing into the stillness. Kale appeared first through the curtain of drifting white, flanked by warriors whose solemn expressions mirrored the hard line of his jaw. His eyes burned with a quiet fury, not loud or wild, but tight and controlled, like something held too long in the fist. He halted several paces from her, letting the wind fill the space between them, as though even winter wished to keep them apart. His voice cut through the cold with sharp precision. He repeated the order he had given days ago, reminding her that she was to leave by morning. There was no room for negotiation, no hint that mercy might be carved from the ice in his tone. Yet Jane did not bow her head. Instead, she straightened her spine, the movement so subtle it might have been mistaken for a shiver. She told him she would go, because she would not force conflict, but she asked that he allow her until sundown. Her voice trembled only once, then steadied like a flame protected by cupped hands. Kale studied her with an expression carved from stone. Perhaps he expected tears or pleas, or the collapse of a girl already pushed to the edge. But Jane stood unchanged, and something like uncertainty flickered across his features. Before he could respond, Talon emerged from behind the group, stepping into her line of sight with the quiet certainty of a man who had already chosen his path. His gaze found hers instantly, searching, questioning, almost pained. He told Kale the request was fair, that the day's end would not alter the land or the tribe's position. Kale shot him a glare sharp enough to sever bone, but Talon did not look away. The unspoken rift between them widened, stretching like a canyon shaped by years of unvoiced truths. Kale finally granted the request, though the words left his mouth with the bitterness of surrender. As the warriors turned to leave, Talon lingered. His attention rested on her, as if he feared she might crumble the moment silence returned. She offered him a small smile, something fragile, something meant to reassure him, even when she felt her own resolve bleeding thin. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper carried by the wind. He told her that Kale would not bend again, and that resistance would only bring harm. He spoke with the careful restraint of a man walking the edge of loyalty and desire. She felt her throat tighten at the tenderness hidden beneath his warnings. When Talon finally left, the valley seemed to sag under the weight of everything unspoken. Jane returned to the cabin and resumed packing, each object she touched feeling heavier than memory alone could account for. As she folded blankets and stacked the small pieces of her life, she felt the first sting of tears she had fought to hold back. The sound of her father's rocking chair creaking in the corner pulled her toward it unexpectedly, and she sat there with her hands clasped around trembling breaths. She allowed herself to cry, not like someone defeated, but like someone finally allowing grief to spill after carrying it too quietly. She did not notice Talon until his shadow stretched across the floor. He entered without a word, closing the door softly behind him. When he saw her tear-stained cheeks, something in his expression fractured, revealing a depth she had only glimpsed before. He knelt in front of her, unsure whether to touch her or hold back. His hands hovered near hers, fingers trembling with the weight of what he wished he could offer. She whispered that she was not afraid of leaving the land. She was afraid of leaving him. The words slipped out before she could stop them, raw and trembling, carrying the truth her heart had fought to hide. Talon inhaled sharply, as though her confession struck a place inside him he had spent years shielding. His eyes burned with 1,000 questions, 1,000 confessions of his own, yet he said nothing. Silence wrapped around them like a fragile cocoon. He rose abruptly, torn between duty and the ache in his chest, and walked toward the door. She called softly after him, but he did not turn. He paused only for a single breath, shoulders rigid, then disappeared into the storm gathering outside. Jane stood in the doorway long after he was gone, watching the snow swallow his figure until only the echo of his footsteps remained. And in the hollow quiet that followed, she felt the truth settle with a weight that stole her breath. Talon's silence had not been refusal. It had been the sound of a man breaking apart in a way he did not yet know how to mend. Dawn crawled across the valley like a wounded animal, spilling faint streaks of crimson across the snow as though the sky itself bled for what was about to unfold. Jane stepped outside with her single packed bag held against her chest, her breath forming clouds that vanished almost as quickly as she could draw them. She had slept little, caught between the ache of leaving and the fragile hope that Talon's silence meant something other than surrender. The air carried the metallic scent of a storm waiting in the mountains, a quiet warning that the day would not pass gently. Her boots sank into the snow with a soft crunch as she walked toward the frozen yard, placing one foot in front of the other with the resignation of someone who had already buried too many versions of herself. Each step pulled her farther from the safety her father had once promised this land would offer. She reached the wooden fence that marked the boundary of her home, and for a moment she simply stood there, staring at the valley as though hoping it might speak. But the world remained still, holding its breath. A low rumble broke the silence. Hooves. Many of them. She turned slowly as Kale emerged through the pale dawn, flanked by several warriors whose faces carried the grim weight of duty. Their presence pressed against the quiet morning like a storm pressing against fragile windows. Kale's expression was carved from unyielding stone, though a flicker of hesitation traced his features when his gaze passed over the packed bag at her feet. She had obeyed. She had accepted exile without fight or plea. But duty often demanded its rituals, and Kale halted in front of her, as though needing to witness the moment her roots were torn free. He told her it was time, his voice stripped of warmth, as frigid as the wind curling around them. Jane nodded, her hands trembling only once before she steadied them. A sharp gust swept through the valley, carrying with it something heavier than the cold, another presence moving through the rising light. Talon rode into view with the quiet force of a storm contained in human form. His cloak snapped violently behind him, and his eyes, sharp as obsidian warmed by fire, swept immediately to Jane. Something in him cracked visibly at the sight of her with her bag. Her small figure braced against the wind, the resignation in her stance. He dismounted before his horse fully stopped moving, boots sinking into the snow as he strode toward her with steps that left no room for hesitation. Kale barked a warning, But Talon did not slow. He stopped beside Jane, placing himself between her and the warriors with a quiet certainty that made the air thrum. Kale stared at him, disbelief hardening into anger. He demanded Talon step aside, but Talon lifted his chin and refused without a single word of apology. His broad shoulders squared, and his breath rose in cold mist, each exhale weighted with defiance. Jane felt the world narrow into the space between the brothers, an invisible thread tightening with every second. Talon told Kale she would not leave. Not like this, not as if she were something disposable. His voice trembled with the force of truths long buried, and Kale's eyes widened at the rebellion. The warriors shifted uneasily, glancing between the two men who had never stood on opposing sides until now. Kale stepped closer, fury pulsing beneath his calm exterior. He asked Talon if he had allowed a soft-hearted woman to sway him from loyalty, from blood, from everything their people depended on. Talon's expression sharpened, but he did not look away. He said kindness was not weakness. He said compassion was not betrayal. He said Jane had shown more courage tending a wounded child than many men showed in battle. The words struck Kale like blows, revealing the rift between them in painful clarity. Kale reminded him of the tribe's suffering, of the harsh winters, of the need for strength above all else. Talon responded quietly, saying strength meant nothing if it could not bend toward mercy. It was the first time Jane saw the older brother's certainty waver. She stepped forward then, lifting her chin despite her trembling. She told Kale she never meant harm, that she had lived on this land only with reverence, and that she would go peacefully. Her voice softened as she added that Talon's defiance was his own choice, not born from her, but from the truth he carried in his heart. Kale's gaze flicked between them, the storm inside him building like a thunderhead. He asked Talon one final time if this was truly his stance. Talon answered not with words, but by taking Jane's hand, intertwining their fingers as if anchoring himself to something he had searched for all his life. Kale's breath left him in a rush, a cracked sound of betrayal and disbelief. The warriors behind him stiffened, waiting for an order that would change everything. For a long moment, the world held still, the snow pausing midair, the wind flattening itself against the valley walls. Kale looked at Talon, the way a man looks at the ruin of something he built with his own hands. Then he stepped back, shaking his head once, as though surrendering to a truth too heavy to fight. His voice, when it came, was weary. He told Talon that the path he chose would separate him from the tribe, from family, from everything he once belonged to. Talon's jaw tightened, but he did not release Jane's hand. He said some paths were worth the breaking. The warriors lowered their weapons slowly, uncertainty rippling through them, until Kale lifted his hand in silent dismissal. They retreated behind him, one by one, leaving the snow marred only by tracks that would soon vanish beneath the storm. Kale paused once more, turning to Talon with a look that held both grief and reluctant respect. Then he and the others disappeared into the gathering veil of white, swallowed by the storm's hungry mouth. Silence crashed into the valley like a soft wave. Talon turned to Jane, his face stripped of its warrior mask, revealing the raw, trembling man beneath. He stepped closer, his chest rising and falling with breaths he seemed afraid to take. His voice cracked as he spoke her name, as though it carried both salvation and surrender. He told her he tried to walk away, tried to bury what he felt beneath loyalty and tradition, but every step away from her felt like stepping toward a life hollowed by regret. He confessed that her courage had melted something frozen inside him, something he did not know how to thaw alone. He lifted a hand to her cheek, brushing away a tear that escaped before she could stop it, and whispered that he loved her, not with sudden passion, but with a slow, breaking devotion he had resisted until the fight nearly tore him apart. Jane's breath trembled as she leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his palm anchor her. She felt her heartbeat steady, her fear dissolving into something fierce and bright. She told him she loved him too, that her confession had been truth born from a heart she never expected to be seen. His forehead rested against hers, breath mingling with hers, the world narrowing into the soft space between them. The storm built around them, snow swirling gently like blessing or warning, they did not know which. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a reverence that made her heart ache. The world faded beneath the weight of that embrace, leaving only warmth, only breath, only the fragile promise shaped between two souls who had walked through winter alone for too long. When they finally parted, Talon looked toward the mountains where Kale had disappeared. He said the storm would bury tracks today, but not choices. Not love. Not the moment they chose each other over fear. Jane took his hand again, lifting her face to the snowfall. The storm swirled around them like a memory the land itself wanted to keep. The valley, once cold and silent, felt alive, humming with a quiet vow whispered in the breath between winter and dawn. And as they walked back toward the cabin, steps aligned and hearts unhidden, the sky opened above them in a burst of swirling white, as if the winter remembered them and approved.